So Maria, thanks for coming on No Way Out today. We're a service disabled, veteran-owned small business. We are trying to build a bridge between um, helping veterans like ourselves. A lot of our brothers and sisters deal with trauma, and one of the ways that's becoming more and more acceptable, and more there's more and more knowledge and understanding around is psychedelics. We've had a lot of guests on the show recently talking about psychedelics, and you're doing some fascinating work. And what we'd like to do today is build the bridge from where we sit as veterans to what it is that you're doing with Tabula Rasa Ventures and the things that you're doing in psychedelic therapies, and creating more wider access, safe access, and broader understanding for this type of therapy. So why don't you give us a little background on what you're working on now, and then let's go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, guys. And thank you so much for doing the important work you're doing. It all starts with awareness, as we like to say in therapy, or you know, working on traumas and reshaping, rewiring our blueprints of human existence. So, thank you so much for doing this work, for spreading the word, and for having me on the podcast to contribute a little bit about what I've been doing and how we're supporting the space. Maria Velkova. I am a managing partner of Tabula Rasa Ventures, and we also have our nonprofit foundation, which is called Energia. Through Tabula Rasa Ventures work, we invest in early stage companies which are building the infrastructure and technologies to enable this novel care delivery model in mental health care, where it is not just here's a prescription, go and take this SSRI for the rest of your life, or here's your therapist, you speak to them for 1 hour every week, but really combining those two interventions and assisting the therapeutic component of this therapy with these ancient novel medicines is what a lot of people call them. They've been around for millennia, actually, but psychedelic-assisted therapy. And in modern times, we have seen such incredible efficacy for a lot of people. At the forefront, veterans. Veterans have been the population of patients and people who have the highest unmet need, with very limited tools and resources to really get back, reclaim their life, and heal those traumatic moments that they've experienced serving our country. So that's the space where my business partner and I have been very active. Our general thesis for our fund is building the future of human health. So it stretches beyond that, but really most of our work over the last 5.5 years has been in the psychedelic therapeutic space, which is a true catalyst for rethinking how we do healthcare in our modern times. The reactive symptom management, disease management, keeping the person at bay, versus the personalized, really truly holistic and disease modifying approach, which psychedelic assisted therapy is. On the other hand, with our nonprofit foundation, and very aligned to what you guys are doing here, we do a lot of impact initiatives, starting with education. We've been around the world. We've hosted pretty substantial platform at Davos, alongside the World Economic Forum, where all of the world's leaders congregate once a year to discuss the most pressing needs and challenges that we're facing as a as a species, and the impact of our troubles and challenges on the environment, and etc. So really educating the global leaders who have a lot of power and say in what happens. And also even the Middle East. We brought psychedelic education for the first time in the Arab world. We've done some work there. and have connected specifically with organizations who work with veterans. So yeah, that's kind of like the introduction. Happy to dive into any part that your audience might find interesting. So thank you once again for having me.
Tell us about where we've been and where you see us at now as far as acceptance goes, because there's always been a very negative connotation of psychedelics, particularly in this country, with, you know, they think to the hippies and things like that, and they think about mind control, and they put these things like LSD and others on Schedule 1. And, you know, where do you see us? Where we kind of know where we've been, and we've had some other guests talk about how that's transitioned, but where do you see it now? Naturally in a positive light, because you have a fund that's creating more awareness and investment in this, but where do you see us now, and where are you really hopeful?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very important to mention that, you know, I refer to these as novel ancient medicines because they have been used for millennia. Really, they entered our modern day framework of of existence and human experience in the Western world is back in the 50s and 60s, when scientific researchers have started looking at these very powerful medicines. Albert Hoffman was the person who has discovered, for example, LSD. He's known to be the first recorded person to really experience a psychedelic LSD experience. And he was working with pharmaceutical companies back in the day. And that really sort of opened up, along with other small events where, Maria Sabina was sort of discovered by the Western world, and she was serving psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, and all of these culminated in our interest into these. They have been highly researched in controlled settings, meaning in a very safe way. They have been prescribed for various ailments very successfully, mental health ailments, for example, for addictions, for couples therapy, for anxiety and depression. However, all of this research started, in the 50s and 60s around the Vietnam War. And the issue was that, they leaked out into the public, where they started being used underground. And one thing that psychedelics medicines do, if used in the appropriate and correct way, is they allow you to feel deeply connected to yourself, to oneself, and also deeply connected to others, and also deeply connected to nature. So all the hippies, as they were called, were these people who were connected to themselves, to others, and to nature, and really didn't want to go halfway around the world to fight in a war, and to, wars come with very, very traumatic experiences. I don't need to tell you guys or the audience. I'm probably not the best one to speak, but these people didn't want to go to war. So the story is that President Nixon, put into action the Controlled Drugs Act, which started the war on drugs as we know it in our culture, against these therapies, because a lot of the young people didn't want to go to war and were protesting against the Vietnam War. Human existence is very complex, and unfortunately, there are still currently, as we speak, ongoing wars around the world, many wars around the world, which tear apart not only the material, cities we live in, but our internal realities. And unfortunately, these things are still happening. Hopefully one day we will awake and recognize that that's not the best way to resolve conflict. Nixon started the war on drugs, and that's where a lot of propaganda and stigma that wasn't rooted in scientific evidence started being started being communicated to people. So all of this research just got canceled, or a little bit of it went underground. However, in the past decade, there has been a rekindling of the interest in these therapeutics by prominent universities around the world who are doing experimentation and really showing the impact, if delivered correctly, if used correctly, the impact on, as Gabor Mate says, traumas with a big T, but also traumas with a small t.
There's more than to psychedelics than just healing. There's also a better understanding of how the brain works. And for me, you and I met down in Miami several years ago, I think on accident, down at Wonderland. And what I've learned since participating in psychedelic-assisted therapy is this thing called the free energy principle. There's Robin Carhart Harris, who's working on something known as entropic brain hypothesis and reduced beliefs under psychedelics, which is allowing us to understand how humans sense the external world, how we plan, how we adapt, and how we learn. And this is very much aligned to what Mark and I, and we're doing with the John Boyd's Observe, Orient, Decide, Act loop, which is very, very, very similar to what Carhart Harris and Carl Friston are developing with their free energy principle and of course, Rebus and things like that. We've had other guests come on the show to talk about how we can use that type of thinking in economics, how we can use it over here, how we can use it for war fighting. It's kind of a unifying theory, potentially, on how humans evolve, living systems evolve. So I want to hear, we have a lot of guests come on here, and we have a lot of friends that have podcasts that talk about psychedelic assisted therapies. I generally go on and talk on those shows when I can with my friends that have gone through this. I'm curious, what kind of ecosystem are you seeing as an investor? What are psychedelics doing for the healthcare ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. I'm trained academically. I studied pharmacology and bioscience. So I was really fascinated by how the body works on a molecular level from a very young age. Now I'm equally fascinated about how the human experience works. And for me, it's pretty fascinating that we don't really know. And thank you for bringing the scientific angle, because that's my bread and butter. And I really am excited about not only the healing potential, but how these compounds and medicines are helping us to understand how the human experience works. And I love how you said the entropic brain. Robin Carhart Harris is one of the leading experts and researchers in this space. And I always like to make the analogy of when babies are born, they don't have frameworks of human existence. We put those there. We, meaning the parents, the peers, the educational system, society, culture. We're born as tabula rasa, which means clean slates, and really get conditioned into living in this world. If you think about the story of Tarzan, he was raised by gorillas and monkeys. So, his conditioning was not that of our modern human experience. And also, it's very important to state that different parts of the world have different types of culture and conditioning. So we're not the same, and we really become byproducts of our world that we live in, and that we're directly thought about or not, or indirectly. I'm reading probably one of the most incredible books I've ever come across. It's called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. Highly, highly, highly recommended. It's very fascinating. But it's helping me learn about my own self as well. And to your point, these, as I always say, our world, external world, the human world, not natural world, but anything that's not made by nature, anything that's made by man, whether it be a desk or a house or a financial system or a healthcare system or government. these things are a reflection of our internal environments. So our internal environments, as I said, get shaped by our experience of being alive. And for veterans, again, just to stay relevant to our audience in this podcast, they can be stimulated by positive things that happen, but also negative things that happen. And when negative things happen, the brain goes into fight or flight in survival mode. And it imprints this experience into our human experience or blueprint of existence or default mode network, whichever phrase you want to use to describe it. And long past that experience, it still gets lodged in there if it's not properly processed, emotionally processed. But anyway, so the point that I wanted to make is that what we put out into the world is a direct reflection of our internal environment. And what I'm seeing in how the psychedelic ecosystem is being built and how it's impacting our healthcare system, it's truly reflected of the people that are building this ecosystem. And many of us come from very different life experiences, from very different situations. There's not only entrepreneurs or doctors, there's also lawyers, there's bankers, there's political figures. It's such a diverse tapestry of individuals that are building this ecosystem, and most of them have had their own lives impacted by these therapies, or at least impacted by them bringing awareness and consciousness to this blueprint of human experience. So I see a lot more collaboration in the psychedelic space. My background, I used to work in big pharma. That's probably helpful to mention. But I see a lot more collaboration. I see a lot more intentionality that's grounded in something bigger than ourselves. Not like competition. I need to be the best. I need to make the which is so true. We live in a capitalist world, but the main intention is to bring healing to others that we have experienced ourselves. And I don't see that as much in other industries, certainly not in the pharmaceutical industry, which I have direct experience of, but also through all of the individuals that I have crossed paths with and worked directly with. For example, Wall Street and the financial system certainly doesn't have this air and nature of collaboration and working together towards a purpose that's bigger than ourselves, and that's reflecting in how we build our businesses.
Ponch, and Maria, to be clear, you've spent zero time in the military, correct? Yourself?
That is correct.
So I've not heard such a beautiful explanation of John Boyd's orientation as you just gave a few minutes ago. You absolutely nailed it out of the park. And as Ponch has said before on other episodes with guests, so you know nothing of John Boyd, yet at the same time you know everything, because you just beautifully described how orientation is our inner computation, our inner understanding of what it is that we deal with in reality. And I think all three of us would agree that's one of the values of psychedelics, to help us understand that reality better. So, Ponch, would you agree?
I was thinking the same thing. I was just listening to it like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what orientation is, and it scales.
Absolutely.
So a couple of things to unpack there. Pharmaceutical industry has an orientation. That orientation, from my perspective, is you want to maintain a customer. You get them addicted to something. You want a customer for life. In the psychedelic space, you don't have a customer for life, right? You don't do psychedelics every single. You don't want So there's a conflict here that Wall Street may need to look at, which is, hey, how do we make money off of something that makes people healthy versus how do we make money off of something that keeps people addicted to, like a benzodiazepine or something like that, right? So walk us through the conflict there and how this resolves over time.
Yeah. definitely. Two things. One, I'm very happy the message is being repeated because it's fundamentals of existence. It's true. That's why it's being repeated with different words and language, but really that same message. Every single human is experiencing the same thing. And with that, I also would like to say that, it's not that every single individual within a certain orientation or system has malintentions. It's really systemic. It's so big that we don't even realize how it's impacting how we show up in the world. So I certainly know that like many of our systems are very, very broken, but also in every system there's always a handful of individuals who, honestly, to be fair, have had very horrible trauma themselves and are projecting it in a way that's not healed, and have malintentions maybe. But generally, even in the pharmaceutical industry, the people I've worked with are the sweetest, nicest individuals. It's just you get when you're so deep into a certain lens of experience and you don't take a step back to look around. Wait a minute, like, what am I doing here? It's you get lost in it, and we all experience that in small ways, even on day to day. Something happens, or you feel like you said the wrong thing, or you feel like you let someone down, and you get so deep in it and you don't look up to see, okay, everything is made up and you're the author of your own experience, and you have every moment of every day the opportunities to start fresh and change your life if you choose to do so. So yeah, in the pharmaceutical industry, which has been built over centuries, it was, or not pharmaceutical industry, but more generally our legacy healthcare systems, they were built initially to be reactive on purpose, to be able to contain infectious diseases. That's how it all started with cholera, with these infectious diseases that you needed to be reactive. There is some car accident and you need to be reactive. And I think it wasn't intentionally built to some respect just to make money. Our legacy healthcare system has worked wonders and miracles. Several decades ago, our life expectancy was, in our 40s, 50s, and that has continuously been increasing. However, we are getting to a point where that's not enough. And reactive disease management is no longer enough. And our science is evolving to understand better what health means. So when I mentioned that our fund invests into the future of human health, our 4 pillars that we look at are very much aligned to psychedelic-assisted therapy, which is personalized. It's not like you go once a year, 15 minutes to the doctor's office and they tell you, okay, great or not. Like, what can you find out in 15 minutes about health? You can't really find out anything. You only find out if something's wrong. So this future of health, which psychedelic-assisted therapy is the catalyst, very big catalyst, is personalized. The person gets to sit with a therapist for multiple hours of therapy during the preparation phase of the intervention, during the dosing, and during the integration. It's also disease modifying. It goes to the root cause. It doesn't just numb your feelings of anxiety and depression. It actually helps you process the root cause that these are coming from in order to be able to then go on with your life without needing to take medicine every day. It's also holistic. It's not just like, oh, there's a symptom, here's a drug for it. You go and you look at your life holistically. again, Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, paints a beautiful picture about that. Most doctors don't ask the patient, how is your life situation? A lot of autoimmune disease, neurological disease, cardiovascular disease, asthma, these are all triggered by mental health. Because if you're constantly living in stress and anxiety, it creates actual physical ailments. But most doctors don't ask, are you living in a safe environment? Do you have anything really traumatic that happened to you in your life? So like psychedelic assisted therapy is really holistic because it looks at the full picture of your life, and also democratized. Again, a lot of people are not happy that we live in a capitalist world, and that's not per se impossible to change, but it's so ingrained in how we operate in the Western world. Everything is linked to that it takes many, 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 many decades for such massive systemic change to occur. And the healthcare system too, that's a big system. The financial system too, our governance systems, when they're so big and so ingrained in our human existence, it takes a long time to change. But what I'm seeing in the psychedelic space is that there's a lot of initiative. How do we get these therapies which really work to as many patients as possible? So there are different programs. There's different support programs that help. For example, you mentioned Jesse Gold with Heroic Hearts. It's a nonprofit organization. They are helping veterans to be able to experience psychedelic-assisted therapy outside of the U.S. And yeah, so democratize. How do we get these therapies which actually work, which target the root cause, which are personalized, which are holistic to as many patients and people as possible? And there's many different paths for that to happen. One is the medicalization path, which is, going through the FDA approval process, but you also have the decriminalization and legalization path, which is state by state, similar to cannabis. And you have the religious exemption path, which is, accessing these therapies through a church where, for example, the Native American church, where that's their sacrament, or even taking people outside of jurisdictions where these medicines are scheduled to indigenous indigenous tribes where they're being practiced, and these folks are so gracious to be able to share their indigenous wisdom with us as well. And so, yeah, that's how I'm seeing, the psychedelic assisted therapy and the psychedelic ecosystem differentiating from our healthcare system, and is a true catalyst. How do we look at health, not just disease management?
Do people, so, when you're pitching the fund and the investment, other than, well, we don't have the money, but what are the objections that you get, or what are some of the what are some of the pushback that you get that you work to overcome?
Yeah, I feel like there's a couple of levels. So on the fund side, a venture capital fund, the way that works is that my family are immigrants to the U.S., and my business partner's family are refugees from the Crimea back in the 90s. So we don't come from family wealth, and how we are able to invest capital into these projects is by going out there and educating investors, people with money, to entrust us with their capital in order to put it into the right projects and the right companies that are aligned to what they believe in. Again, this is touching capital, so there's still a lot of stigma out there. A lot of people don't believe that the FDA will approve these therapies. I beg to disagree, although, we're approaching a very important date in just 10 days, a week and a half.
10 days. Yeah.
Exactly, where the FDA will give their first, decision on whether they approve or not, or anything in between MDMA-assisted therapy, which is the first classic psychedelic-assisted therapy going through the system. So, when money is involved, some people have surplus, or you don't even have to have surplus, but some people really believe in these therapies, and they're crucial for innovation, where they're giving philanthropic donations.
Mm-hmm.
But if I come and ask you, okay, can you give me $250,000, and there's absolutely no guarantee you're ever going to see that money back, but it might help to bring these new therapies forward, not a lot of people can part with that kind of money. And to build a completely new healthcare system for behavioral health, for mental health, it takes capital to be able to scale it and provide broad patient access. So there's still pushback. There's stigma. But a lot of people do believe in it. Their lives have been touched by it. But with anything so innovative, although again, these have been around for a very long time, but anything that's innovative. I mean, if you think crypto, Uber back in the day, like all of these new concepts of building businesses, they're risky, but that's how innovation happens. And certain investors have an appetite for the very risky stuff, because they know for a fact, and they see certain things that they know that this will be successful, or has a high potential to be successful. But there's other people who are a little bit more risk averse. And once we, show a proof of concept and that this works, and it's all the way through the FDA approval process, it's already being deployed and administered in our healthcare systems, more and more capital starts to flow in. Capital has different tastes for risk, let's say, and different people have different tastes for risking their capital. So in the 4.5 years that I have been in this space, it has been an interesting time, not only for psychedelics, but venture capital, meaning risky investments in general. In 2021, when there was 0% interest rate and literally money was being printed because of the COVID pandemic, our whole world went into a very unique situation that's never happened before on the scale that it has happened, and into the connected scale it has happened in our human existence. So there was surplus capital. A lot of money was being invested into more risky stuff. But then as our economic systems shifted with the COVID pandemic, money became much more tight for everyone. We saw the layoffs, a lot of unemployment was affected. So when money is tight, then less money goes into the riskiest and most innovative stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been through a cycle. Typically, venture capital goes through cycles. We're seeing an interest rekindle right again. I think we're very far into critical mass with the research with these therapies that there's no going back. Way too many people's lives have been transformed by these therapies for the system to say no, where there's no other options for patients. But again, it is a massive system, so it takes time. It takes time to change it at the root, at the fundamentals.
So you brought up an upcoming date, and we'll try to get this podcast released before then. I think it's August 11th, as FDA is looking at approval for MDMA-AT, which is a MDMA-assisted therapy. And I got a letter here actually in front of me that went to President Biden, Vice President Harris as well, and it says phase 3 clinical trials of MDMA-AT resulted in 71% of participants no longer qualifying for a PTSD diagnosis. 71%, right? 86% of the participants experiencing clinically significant improvement in their symptoms. So this isn't a letter that went to the President of the United States, signed by many, many veterans in the last couple of weeks. And again, the president doesn't have anything to do with the approval of the FDA approval. Can you tell us what you're sensing coming out of I think we had a little bit of a rough, is it ICER? Did I get that right? A couple months ago?
ICER and the FDA advisory committee.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you give us your perspective on what you think is going to happen in the next couple of weeks?
Oh gosh, if I had a crystal ball, but I
Yeah.
can give you my perspective based on all of the data I do have. So just for a little bit of context, typically any drug that goes through the FDA approval process, any drug from big pharma, from psychedelics, the FDA appoints an independent advisory committee of experts to look at the submission, the clinical data that was submitted, and to give their opinion. Now, the FDA doesn't always have to follow, they don't have to follow the advisory committee recommendations. They can make their own assessment. So for psychedelic-assisted therapy, and more specifically for MDMA-assisted therapy, which is closest to approval, and it's currently, this year it has been reviewed by the FDA. That advisory committee happened about 2 months ago. Everyone has been so excited because I'm not going to repeat the results, but typically with the current drugs, antipsychotics and SSRIs, less than 25, depending on which statistics you look at, percent of patients actually receive any benefit at all. And the 71% that you said lost their diagnosis of PTSD, that can be analogous to remission in oncology. So the cancer could come back, but it's not there any longer for a long time. So this is what MDMA-assisted therapy resulted in for patients that were in the clinical trials. And we are having the long-term follow-ups to show for how long they didn't qualify for the PTSD diagnosis. But it's anywhere between 6 months to 12 months, and for some people even longer. So the big surprise was that during the advisory committee, actually the sentiment was very negative. Now, a lot of very good feedback was shared. I don't want to discredit that, but I think the focus of the advisory committee was not at the bottom line here. So one of the main issues that the advisory committee raised was around the placebo effect, or being aware whether you're on MDMA or not. The way that the clinical trials were ran was that one of the groups of patients received MDMA-assisted therapy. The other group of patients received placebo, basically no pharmaceutical treatment, and just therapy. So it's quite, because these are mind consciousness expanding compounds. You can definitely tell if you're on a psychedelic or an MDMA or not. So this unblinding in the clinical trial, meaning patient can guess whether they're on the drug or not, was one of the main critiques that almost like overpowered the entire, it's a full day discussion between these experts. Now, for me, okay, great. Yes, that could skew the results. However, Lycos/MAPS, who is the company that's developing this therapy, they actually showed in the data that the outcome of the efficacy was so large that actually it could not have been just because the patient, and these are people who have been struggling with PTSD for a decade or longer. You can't just think yourself into remission. If it was that easy, we wouldn't have PTSD wouldn't be such a big issue in our world. So they showed with data.
Isn't it worth pointing out too? We're partial to veterans. We come from that world, but trauma and PTSD is not limited to veterans by any means. There's I don't know, postpartum depression. There's sexual assault trauma. There's wide categories of trauma that it really does help a wide. I mean, the band of people that can be helped is, veterans is a huge, obviously a huge chunk of that one that's very near and dear to our hearts. And there's a lot more. And so people's understanding and awareness would be well served, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And the trials for MDMA-assisted therapy, of course, included a lot of veterans, but also sexual assault victims as well. So it was a diverse patient population that went through the clinical trials. So yeah, I mean, like I'm a trained scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. My orientation, like you guys said, is a scientist, and like I was in the pharmaceutical world, and so I know that it is important. The scientific method is important for a reason, to be able to truly say whether something worked or not, and the null hypothesis, etc. But the funny thing is that in big pharma, something called real world evidence, which means evidence or data from the real world outside of a clinical trial, from everyday life, is the holy grail. It's so important to have real world evidence. But then if you call it anecdotal evidence, meaning it wasn't originally a therapy wasn't originally researched in a clinical trial, but like that data is coming from real world experiences of people, it's like, oh no, that's not good enough. Okay, it's pretty much the same thing. We're just calling it different words. But either way, these trials did not only have evidence from the real world. These trials had evidence from controlled clinical settings, which is the standard of getting a drug approved by the FDA. But the advisory committee, picked so much on the clinical trial design, which, by the way, was designed in partnership between the FDA and MAPS / Lycos. The FDA said, okay, this is the trial design that we're using. And they picked on the trial design so much for such a big percentage of the advisory committee meeting of the day that it's like, do we care that they might be unblinding? Or do we care that 71% of patients went into remission? These are patients who, again, for decades have not had relief from PTSD at all. So I feel like, that's why psychedelic assisted therapy is a catalyst into how do we actually look at healthcare, because it has shown really substantial, true proof scientifically, efficacy and really great results for these patients. So there was a lot of negativity around the advisory committee. There's still a lot of stigma and trauma. And, if we look on any layer of our human existence, personal or in our family or in our community or in our whatever system, healthcare system, change is scary and change is hard and change takes a lot of commitment and it doesn't happen overnight. If you try to change your behavior, but like for addictions, for example, like it's scary because like, that the alcohol or whatever the person is addicted to, shopping, food, it gives them comfort. It provides like a safe space because they're so used to it. And like getting off of that is scary. Or like changing a job, even changing a job, even changing, moving to a new city. Change is scary and it takes time. So I'm not surprised that a lot of the experts on the advisory committee were still stigmatized. This is a very new approach to therapy. So there was a lot of negative comments. A lot of people were very shocked and disappointed that like we didn't look at the big picture and the bottom line, which is, the percentages of the efficacy and the results that you mentioned. But this is still not, the final results. So on August 11th, the FDA will consider all of the data. It will consider the advisory committee recommendations. It would consider ICER's recommendations. It would consider everything that has been presented about MDMA-assisted therapy to make their decision. And there's 3 possible outcomes. One, it gets approved, which means that a trained professional can prescribe this nationally for PTSD specifically. 2, they can say, no, it's not approved, and that's it, which would be a really, really big loss because the unmet need for these patients is immense. There's no other therapies. And because behavioral health, psychiatry, and mental health are such difficult conditions, because maybe we're looking at them wrong or have been looking at them wrong, big pharma is not developing any drugs for these ailments. So what I think, personally, with my lens of experience, and I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you what the outcome is going to be, but I think a straight up no is extremely unlikely. And if there's a straight up no, it would be extremely disappointing to a lot of people who are suffering. So I really don't believe that the outcome will be a straight up no, because again, as I mentioned, the MDMA-assisted therapy trials were designed together with the FDA. The FDA is on board. I have spoken with the leadership team of Lykos and also with Rick Doblin, who is the main person who started this whole 40-year-long process of getting MDMA approved. And they've spoken to FDA. That's normal for any drug developer to be in communications with the FDA to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do in order to increase the probability to approve these therapies. So I don't think it's going to be a straight up no. There is a small chance it could be just a yes. I think the most likely scenario will be maybe they need more data. There were certain things in the trials that could have been improved, but this is the first psychedelic-assisted therapy going through this process. So there's a lot of learning involved. And I think the most probable outcome is that the FDA might ask to do another phase 3 clinical trial where they take into account, meaning Lykos, takes into account all the feedback of how the trials can be improved to make sure that everything's great. But it doesn't necessarily need to be in an actual phase 3 trial. A lot of this data that was missing on the safety, for example, or these small little tweaks, this can be done post-launch, meaning after approval as well. So there is a chance that it could be a yes, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see.
I mean, you're a scientist, and we've heard the phrase in the last couple of years, trust the science is settled. As you know, science is always meant to be challenged and developed. And in this case, with this particular therapies, I mean, the science is overwhelming, right? The support for helping people, and if I was going to explain it to a non-scientist, I would explain that this is actually, the evidence is overwhelming that this helps people, resolve their trauma, as you say, go into remission.
Yeah. And important point to mention is science in the way that we practice it is a man-made, we created science, which is the study of the natural world or of a disease or of something. We created that. And our science is limited by our tools and understanding and our knowledge. Science evolves with the evolution of discoveries. It evolves with our tools getting better for measuring stuff. I always like to say, before we can, us almighty humans could measure and use X-rays in a medical setting. Yeah, X-rays have been there since the beginning of eons. Since the beginning of time. The X-ray is an energetic wave. Before we could measure it and then manipulate it for healthcare purposes, X-rays were there since the beginning of time. So just because we can't measure something yet, also doesn't make the science is absolutely completely right. We've come up with a system to measure things in a way that is very helpful and important to say whether something is true or not. Well, it's not even true or not. The know-how hypothesis means that this could not be disproven. It's not, this is an absolute truth.
It's evolving. Right?
It evolves. It evolves with our tools. And I think we know so little about the brain itself, like the material, the structural signaling pathways and in the brain and neuronal connections and which parts of the brain control what. We know very little. We don't know everything about the brain. We know very little about the mind, psychiatry. We know very little about that. In the intersection of both, literally no one knows how that happens. No one knows how serotonin signaling in the brain creates human experience. And we're starting to learn that. To our earlier point, psychedelics are really helping us to understand that with, the default mode network. Babies are born, tabula rasa, clean canvas. We condition them to exist in a certain way as humans in our modern world. But that's thought, that's put there. And then we start living our lives from this autopilot existence, which is very important for survival. We can't be going outside of our house and thinking like, am I going to get killed by a lion in every moment of our day? Because that's, what kind of life would that be? But actually, going back to veterans and PTSD more generally, that's what people live in. They live in a state of like constantly being afraid for their life and their survival. So yeah, like our understanding is evolving, but it's much bigger than just like, oh, there's too much serotonin or there's too little serotonin. It's so much more than that. And we're only starting to understand how all of that interconnects now. Just to like touch on the point of science, but to your point, yes, these trials were done in the most scientific way and they have shown extremely positive results.
Overwhelmingly so. So as we close here and we encourage people to have as you say, a clean slate, a clean canvas in their mind and open up and make the effort to learn more about these things, what are some of the resources that you would direct people to go and learn more and crunch their learning curve on the wider use of psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opinions out there, and there's as many opinions as there's humans on this planet, because our blueprints are as different as our experiences, and no two humans have had the same exact experience. As a scientifically trained person, I really look to peer-reviewed articles, something that's scientifically proven or not, or like at least being researched in a scientific manner. So peer-reviewed journals, there's a lot of papers being published. They're very difficult to read. So actually, one of my favorite resources is Psychedelic Alpha. It's a very, very sort of balanced reporting on the psychedelic industry, on the psychedelic research, on every aspect of it. Josh Hardman is someone who I really respect, and the way he writes, and it's it's difficult to write from in a non-biased way because we're naturally just biased, like to our own experience. But Psychedelic Alpha is definitely one awesome source. There's tons of podcasts out there that are really awesome. Andrew Huberman from the big podcasters like Andrew Huberman. He doesn't only speak about psychedelics, but he has a couple of really awesome podcasts to talk about like how these things work. Again, my go-to is Psychedelic Alpha. There's other sort of media like Double Blind is a really incredible resource. It's a magazine about psychedelics, and they have a very different sort of lens of reporting, but it has a lot of integrity. The reporting there. Also, Lucid News is another very well-balanced resource where people can learn more and more about the psychedelic space. And Ken Jordan, the founder of Lucid News, rest in peace. He actually passed away recently. So I just wanted to, honor him here for the work that he's done as well in his lifetime to help educate people. Yeah.
Well, and of course, we want them to go to your website as well. So it will have links to those.
Yeah, my LinkedIn, I'm pretty active. I do share a lot of articles, and our link with the AIs and everything, our LinkedIn's or Instagrams or social media is primed for seeing certain content, and I've been priming mine for like 5 years. So I get to see a lot of the great um, knowledge sources in media. So I share that a lot. So Maria Velkova on LinkedIn. Instagram as well, Maria V Velkova. That's a little bit of a different lens. LinkedIn's my business, purely my business cap on, but you'll see my very diverse interest on my Instagram. For example, I love creative costume design. So I don't only post the scientist business stuff, but also some more fun stuff. And there I actually share a lot of accounts, different accounts that dive into more kind of like self-healing, a really positive messaging as well, really profound stuff. I share books there. Again, The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. Like, it's just, this book is like, I can't even put it down. It's so great, and it explains. It's written in a great way. Yeah.
And then, of course, we'll link to Tabula Rasa's link and also Energia. So
on Tabula Rasa, you can see the companies we invest in, and also on Energia, you can check out some of our impact initiatives globally that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So yeah, those two.
Awesome. Well, hey, we want to thank you for coming and spending time and talking about this with us, Maria. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys, and thank you for your work.
Yeah. Don't go anywhere.